Feminism is a conservative position. Hear me out. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and I know for a fact that this video is going to ruffle feathers from both sides of the political aisle, because it simultaneously makes feminists and self-identified conservatives just a bit annoyed every time I make this argument. But one thing that I've learned is that when you're doing something worthwhile intellectually regarding socio-political issues, you're probably doing something right when you're pissing off everybody. At least when it's the times where they can't even say why what you just said made them mad. That being said, you've undoubtedly noticed by now the strong similarities between clips like these from feminists and clips like these from Christian conservatives.
And representations of women as decorative elements to try and sell games to boys and men soon became the norm for the burgeoning industry. In ad after ad throughout the 80s and 90s, we see women placed on display alongside arcade games, conflating the two and presenting them both as toys to be played with. In these promotional materials, advertisers are not just selling a product, they're also selling gaming as a lifestyle, in which women predominantly exist as passive objects of heterosexual male desire.
Kowalski remembers most as a boy came from his mother's bedroom when her various boyfriends slept over. On a visit to his dad's, he learned what those sounds were when he found porn magazines and videos. Secretly watching the videos became a highlight of his visits.
I felt a sense of curiosity, excitement. To me, it was normal because that's all I've witnessed, that's all I've.
Obviously, the similarity in their message towards men is that heterosexual male sexual desires are to be demonized, ensuring that men should, at the very least, feel guilty for looking at pictures of naked or scantily clad women. Which obviously there's an argument to be made for when men do it too much, but it shouldn't be cured with mere shaming alone, as if the act of enjoying looking at sexy women is completely horrible. Next, I'll direct you to Exhibit B.
And writing about rape. In all of the emails that I've gotten from, peeling through the ones that say to me that I'm just jealous because no one wants to rape me because I'm too ugly. Because, of course, the only thing worse than being raped is being considered not pretty enough to be raped. Right, Tracy?
Right clothes and a perfect manicure, and you can be the most gorgeous person in this room or any other. But if you don't have a love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, it's pretty wrapping paper around an empty box. Gosh, I was hoping I was going to get one of those. I was like...
The similarity here in their message towards women is that it's somehow not necessarily a good thing or particularly important to be good looking. In the feminists' case, anybody who shames women for being ugly basically just kind of doesn't get it. And in the Christian woman's case, she makes it clear that being Christian is far more important than looking nice. However, these are merely vague similarities in how both Christians and feminists tend to speak, so I need to back it up a bit and define precisely what I mean when I use the word conservative to describe things. You see, that by itself is a very contentious issue, as there's two very popular ways that people use to define the language that we use as individuals in the English-speaking world. The first that I'm going to mention is the postmodern way of defining language, which essentially claims that the be-all and end-all of how a word is defined is based around popular usage, which sounds like maybe it makes sense if we think about things like slang that is entirely divorced from its original meaning. However, the postmodern way of conceptualizing language falls apart once you realize that postmodernists with political agendas largely just encouraged the populace to start believing that to best reprogram the masses. Supposedly, since it's technically possible to occasionally largely divorce a word's meaning from its original intent, it now should make it permissible to entirely change the definitions of words whenever postmodernists feel like it. And they started with the word racism, of course. They blatantly altered it to the point where it kind of doesn't actually fit the most common usage. Personally, while I'll admit that there are rare exceptions of when words are actually changed entirely, largely having to do with things like drugs and sexual acts that people speak about in coded language so as to not upset the children, I mainly am a traditionalist when it comes to defining language, and thus, I like to look at language in the way that linguists that actually write the dictionary look at language. You see, instead of merely looking at popular word usage at any given moment, which ultimately is impossible to track because every nation, region, city, and even social circle often speaks with a different vernacular at any given moment, linguists trace word origins and take that into very careful consideration every year before they edit a new copy of, say, the Merriam-Webster dictionary. This, of course, is why exactly the fake sociological definition of the word racism has never made it into any dictionaries with any significant presence, besides maybe a second or third definition, or maybe even fourth under the Oxford Dictionary, I believe. Here's the thing. In order to be on the rather large committee that agrees upon word definitions every year, you have to have a very firm background in linguistics. And there simply isn't a PhD holding linguist alive that can't see that changing the definition of racism into a system built by capitalism and white people to oppress people of color. Nobody that's actually a linguist with a PhD doesn't understand that that is a blatant linguistic violation of the characteristics and origins of the word. So it's never changed, even though that fake definition has been around since like the 70s. That being said, as a writer, I like dictionaries in my adult life. Sure, in my youth, my major in college was playwriting, so I purposefully tried relentlessly to stay fresh with slang at all times, and avoided knowing too many $2 words. However, after spending numerous years having to actually read and understand what exactly pretentious neo-Marxist pseudo-intellectuals were trying to make it sound like they were getting at for 20 to 40 minutes on end, when they weren't even really saying anything at all. After having to be very, very good at decoding their cryptically worded run-on sentences full of long, tedious words, well, I realized that we needed to stick to something concrete, and the dictionary, composed by committees of linguists every year, is pretty decent for being that concrete thing that we go by. Thus, when I say that feminism is a conservative position, I am referring very specifically to what the dictionary uses to define the word conservative, and not what many people think of as conservatism in the United States, which, from everything I have gathered, seems to be whatever position the Republican Party holds at any given time, even if it changes dramatically from one administration to the other, and even if it's at odds with itself. So, let's think about feminism. What are its aims, and what are its origins? Well, technically it was defined by a French male socialist in 1837 named Charles Fourier, which predates the publishing of the Communist Manifesto from Karl Marx and Robert Engels by about 11 years. However, though organized activity on the behalf of women's rights and interests has undoubtedly always been around, as there will always be women who aim to make the lives of women and women exclusively better, the most important foundational book in contemporary feminism is undoubtedly Frederick Engels' book, Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Engels, being a good friend, co-author, and patron of Karl Marx, actually published that book a year after Marx's death. So it's entirely unknown precisely what Marx would have thought about the book, as Marx was much more concerned with economic issues and factory workers, etc., while Engels had a strange obsession with marriage being an institution that oppressed women, supposedly. That being said, despite the fact that Engels would not have been remembered in history if it weren't for Karl Marx, and Karl Marx might have hated Engels' silly proto-feminist book anyway, which could have easily been why Engels published it a year after Marx died, still, the female communists of the pre-Cold War, old left era frequently cited Engels' book, Origin of the Family, when they had gender grievances within the Communist Party of the United States of America, and it thus became canon among communists in the United States. However, in spite of the fact that the active old left communists in the United States were generally not aligned with self-identified feminists of the time, this would have been in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, as they felt that they were not concerned with the struggles of working men and what they would call Negroes, because, of course, feminists have always been massively racist towards black men especially, and have always resented rough working class men of all skin colors. Still, even though communism and feminism didn't used to be one and the same exactly, when the old left died in the 1950s and the new left had to grow back in its place, a lot of the thought of the pop culturally relevant women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s ended up being powered by communist women from the old left, and thus, what we now refer to simply as feminism really is almost exclusively communism in panties. And yes, they cite Marx and Engels academically as a lot of their inspiration. That being said, there is a huge argument to be made that anything Marxist is by itself a conservative position, due to the fact that the Communist Manifesto was essentially a religious prophecy that was written over 150 years ago. And not only did Marx's predictions almost unanimously fail to come to pass, but they led to the death of about 100 million people worldwide. So holding on to those books at this point is like holding onto the Old Testament of the Bible or something. But that's somewhat besides the point of this video. What's more important is that the entire worldview that Frederick Engels espoused regarding women being fundamentally oppressed by males is demonstrably false. And not just untrue, but kinda the reverse of what is true. And there's probably a better argument than not to be made that this has always been the case. I personally really like Karen Strawn.
A belief in the historic oppression of women by a system of male dominance that confers unjust and unearned privileges on men. Its entire body of theory rests on this one presupposition, and they will protect it with everything that they have got. But the reality is that in every single metric we would use to demonstrate that blacks are disadvantaged compared to whites, and I've put a few of them up there, men fare more poorly than women, and in many of these metrics, they have always fared more poorly than women.
From a strictly logical and biological standpoint, women would always naturally be treated better in tribes and in societies, because more of them are needed to reproduce than men. So when it comes to repopulating a tribe or civilization that has suffered from a war, a plague, or a natural disaster that killed off many members of the population, women's lives have to have been worth more the whole time evolutionarily. That is purely logical. You can't argue with that. So now that we've brought up wars, I'm sure that we have to answer the question, why do men go to fight in wars? Well, generally, they go to war to compete over resources that they'll eventually gladly sacrifice to the women in their society. Furthermore, when a ship sinks and there's life rafts attached, unless it devolves into pure chaos and some men lose their cool and get obscenely selfish due to terror, they are told women and children first. Also, when there's a flood or forest fire, we all know that it's like 99.9% brave, strong men that do all of the firefighting and rescuing. If this is sexism, which it actually is, it's positive sexism that favors women, and that itself has been the value within almost every tradition in recorded history, with the possible exception of Islam. That being said, the greatest trick that the female devil ever pulled was convincing the world that positive sexism towards women was actually negative discrimination somehow, which some women used to justify grasping for literally every gender advantage that they could think of, which, by no later than the second wave in the 1970s, we've agreed to call feminism. And oh boy, it is ugly. Despite the fact that I would argue that life has always been systemically easier for women, feminism took it a step further. Apparently motivated academically by some book written by a coattail-riding man well over 100 years ago. And now, feminism has been responsible for things like affirmative action quotas being put in place to make it easier for young women to get into universities. And they haven't entirely gone away. Sure, there might have been an argument to be made for helping women get into universities back in the 1960s, but certainly not by 1994, when young women already outweighed young men on university campuses. Still, of course, best-selling feminist authors from 1994 sounded like this.
Girls are coming of age in a very poisonous, girl-hurting culture. Reviving Ophelia is my attempt to talk about the developmental issues of girls this age, the culture they live in, the needs they have at this age that are and are not being met by American culture.
Young women outweigh young men on university campuses by about 59% currently, and there's still programs to help them. Still, for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to go into too much depth regarding other men's rights talking points, but it should be of note that while male suicides compose about 78% of all suicides in the West, males have always been overrepresented in suicide. But when you do a Google search for women's mental health services, you find all of these, and with men, you find, well, very few. You're fortunate to even find a private practice. More so, men have almost no rights in family court. They are still required by federal law to sign up for selective services, aka the draft, when they turn 18. But while women can serve in combat positions if they choose, they very rarely choose to. And there certainly has never been a big feminist push to get women required to sign up for selective services. There also isn't really any gender-specific shelters for men. Men get dramatically longer sentences for the same crime with the same records as women, and young women get hired more often and tend to get higher salaries than young men in the current year in most areas. List really does go on and on. That being said, obviously feminism is a completely dated and ridiculous position to cling to, and yes, it has become institutionalized as the foundational gender religion that we are all born into in the West, where we are told from birth that females are so incredibly holy that they deserve both our protection, but also the freedom to protect us if and when they might choose. According to feminism, women are supposed to need our servitude in the form of child support and alimony, while also the ability to be favored in education and employment if they want to be a fish woman who abandoned that silly bicycle. Finally, one of the biggest things that I find super fascinating to note is that the first "In God We Trust" caption was printed on the United States dollar in 1964, which is 9 years after Emmett Till was falsely accused of sexual misconduct with a white woman, spurring a lynching by men who were associated with the Democratic Party-funded KKK. This, of course, was oddly a bit similar to this woman claiming to have been sexually assaulted 36 years ago by a man that nobody could even verify that she had ever even met.
Gathering came together, but like many that summer, it was almost surely a spur-of-the-moment gathering. I truly wish I could be more helpful with more detailed answers to all of the questions that have and will be asked about how I got to the party and where it took place and so forth. I don't have all the answers, and I don't remember as much as I would like to. But the details about that night that bring me here today are the ones I will never forget.
And so, people should keep in mind that the Democrats historically are the party of the KKK, which probably didn't actually magically flip in the 60s like they said. They are the party of feminism, and even the writing of "In God We Trust" on our bills came after both of those things had already been around for a while. Both the KKK and feminism had been around since before "In God We Trust" was printed on our bills. Because here's the thing. Our nation was founded on secular values with a huge emphasis on freedom of speech, which has been what has allowed us to evolve and revise our ways of doing things over the years. Which is why our dollar bills probably shouldn't have "In God We Trust" written on them. When a Republican says that they're a conservative, it's hard to know what exactly they're talking about, as it's too broad of a term that could apply to too many issues. Is he an Orthodox Jew like Ben Shapiro? Is he a constitutionalist like Ted Cruz? Or is he somebody that largely just believes that he should have the right to say what he wants at any given time, like the First Amendment says, such as Donald Trump? Now, I am not saying that these guys aren't conservative in any way, because there are certainly specific positions that each of these men hold that are conservative by definition. Nor am I here to say that Marxism is more conservative than Christianity, because that's an entirely different discussion, and I haven't entirely decided what I think about that. However, what I am willing to state and stand by, especially after finally writing this video out from beginning to end, even though I've been talking about making it for several months, what I will say is that feminism is categorically, by definition, undeniably a conservative position. Unless you're one of these people that thinks that we should destroy all dictionaries, but if you are, you probably already stopped watching this. More so, compared to feminism, being a men's rights advocate is the liberal position, by definition, and even the progressive position, by definition, even though the word progressive has been co-opted by Marxists since before World War II. So, I ask you, do you want to be a conservative, science-denying, dictionary-denying, evidence-denying feminist? Or can you finally give it up and own the fact that you're an MRA once and for all and meet us in the new world like I did well over a year ago? Choice is yours.